Oh, yeah, good call. It sure did. Um, um, Boom. Stream issues resolved now. Twitch, YouTube. Yep. Cool. Is Twitch live? Twitch is live. I sound okay. YouTube. YouTube should be good. It's doing that stupid thing. Sometimes when I have a YouTube channel or whatever, a stream muted, and then I refresh it or I switch tabs, it doesn't keep going live. It like thinks like I'm not watching or whatever. So like now I have to put this at like 1% volume. So it's not fully muted, but I can't really hear it. But should be good. I think we're good.
All right. You ready to get started?
Yeah.
Hello and welcome to episode 148 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we're talking about the first major of the Call of Duty League season. It's happening this weekend in Madrid, Spain. And we also have some matches that we have to catch up to because we didn't do an episode recently. So we got a lot to talk about in general. Before we get to any of that, how you doing, Bink?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. Like you said, finally, it's finally land time. Literally, it starts at like 10 a.m. Eastern tomorrow. So like 16, 17-ish hours from now, at the time of recording at least. By the time you guys are listening to it, it'll probably be even less than that. So the first land of 2025 season and Black Ops 6 season is rapidly approaching. Finally here. Feels like it's been a long time waiting, but it's here. We're ready to break it all down and get this show on the road.
Yeah, so because we missed the matches from the last week of qualifiers, we're not going to completely skip over them, but we're certainly not going to focus on them too much because, like you said, by the time that people listen to this, the major will already be happening or just about to start. So we want to focus more on the actual major and preview that versus kind of put the attention on the matches that, don't really mean as much now that we're a few days removed from it all. But we will reference back to them, obviously, because we were talking about it before the weekend, but the qualifying or the seeds, for those qualifying matches were very important. And we were expecting some movement in the standings as a result. But let's talk about the major real quick because obviously we've just been waiting. It feels like an eternity now just for some kind of major and some kind of LAN action. And we're finally getting that. And on top of that, this is the first European major or CDL event in almost 5 years, which just seems crazy. We've only really had one in the CDL's history, and now we're getting another. The first time that the CDL has gone to Spain, the first time that major Call of Duty tournament has been to Spain, and I don't know how long. I don't know if like there was a ESWC at one point, or if there was some kind of tournament or like a Gfinity, but it's been a while, if ever, that some of the top players and top teams in the world have been to Spain for a competition. So that should be really exciting. Obviously, we have the Miami Heretics, an all-Spanish team involved in this. But let's start with I'll run down some of the matchups that we're looking at in this first round of Major 1, which is being hosted by the Toronto Ultra, and even though it's not in Toronto. So number 1 seed is Optic Texas. We talked about it on the last episode that we did, that they played Toronto in their last match. It was basically whoever won that very likely would be the number 1 seed. Optic comes away with a win. They get the number 1 seed. And they will play the Miami Heretics, the aforementioned Heretics that you would believe to have some kind of home field advantage, but Optic, as we all know, is the most popular team. And I guess we'll kind of test that theory, which is more popular in Spain, the Spanish team or Optic, which I'm just honestly not sure exactly how that's going to go. And then you have the Carolina Royal Ravens and LA Thieves as like the 4-5 matchup. Toronto Ultra and Vancouver Surge, and then the Boston Breach and Atlanta FaZe to round out the winners bracket. And then the 4 teams in the losers bracket, the teams that you certainly don't want to be flying 10 12 hours overseas. LAG, Vegas Falcons, Minnesota Rocker, and Cloud9 New York. Those 4 teams do not have the buffer that I like to call it of you lose your first round matchup and at least you'll have another chance to advance in the tournament, to get some money, get some points. These teams don't have that, so it's one and done for them if they lose. Any matchup that in particular you want to start with and talk about, because I think this is about as good of first round matchups as I think I could have predicted. There's some really interesting plot lines, just thinking like Optic versus Heretics, like I mentioned, with the fans and how the audience will react to both teams. FaZe and Breach, Boston has been one of the better teams, and them starting in the winners bracket is an unusual circumstance. They are typically not even close to getting in the winners bracket. Here they are. Is there a specific matchup that you would like to start out with?
We can start with the FaZe Boston one that you mentioned. I think, I mean, it's really between that matchup and Carolina LAT for what is going to be the most exciting or potentially the closest first round match in my eyes. The only reason I'm leaning a little bit more towards Boston FaZe than Carolina LAT is just because both Carolina and LAT have had, they aren't coming into this major as strong as potentially fans of those franchises would have liked, especially both those teams were, I believe, 4-0 heading into the Christmas break, and then they've had their own issues or just a little bit of a downturn in recent matches. The interesting thing about this Atlanta Boston match to me is we literally just saw it on Friday in these qualifiers. Boston, we mentioned on our last show, had a really tough week to round out the Major 1 qualifiers, having to play Atlanta and LA Thieves, and they get 3-0 swept by Atlanta. Map 1 was really close, 250 to 234. After that, though, the protocol search was 6-1, and the control was 3-0, with Atlanta winning 2 offenses on protocol, which is kind of just like a stomp. So, that wasn't necessarily the closest match for that, but then Boston responds to that matchup by beating LA Thieves, and I think was that and it was the first match on this past Sunday. But the reason why that gives me, I don't want to say hope, but it gives me like a little bit more excitement for this rematch between Boston and FaZe is because it would have been very easy for Boston teams in the past, or really any team when they're facing down a gauntlet, like having to play FaZe and then LA Thieves, where they get swept in the first series and they're just like, pack it up, they're chalk, their mental's in the drain, however you want to phrase it, and then they get smoked in that second match. But Boston comes out and handles business, beats LA Thieves in 2 searches in a game 5. They go up 2-0 in the series. LAT does push it to a game 5, but Boston ends up closing it out. There were some server issues in there that potentially, hopefully we don't have those repeated on LAN, because we've been seeing disconnects and all that stuff in a variety of matches in this online segment. So that's one of the reasons I'm excited for LAN. I'm rambling, but long story short, yeah, I think just that win for Boston over LA Thieves has me a little bit more excited than if Boston just got smoked by FaZe and LA Thieves. So yes, I think FaZe is still favored against Boston heading into this matchup. But just like Boston is this Boston team is better than the team we saw last year, at least in the CDL part of the season, not counting EWC, Esports World Cup. And like you said, the fact they're even in the winners bracket is got to be exciting for Boston fans who had to endure a rough season last year. But I think in general, yeah, like it's interesting. They just played each other less than a week ago, um. So they might be able to change some stuff up in the vetoes. Either team really, if they want to switch things up. Obviously, FaZe doesn't really have much of a reason to because they look pretty dominant in that series. But end of the day, I do think this will be an exciting one right up there with Carolina and LA Thieves, but just for different reasons because. Um, I think especially with Boston winning that last match against LA Thieves, there it's kind of tough to gauge exactly where they are. I think that was the thing heading into the qualifiers this past week for Boston was I kind of said like this is a tough test, obviously Atlanta and LA Thieves, and we're gonna have to see how they respond and how they come out of those two matches. The fact they're 1-1 as opposed to 0-2, uh, kind of I think just at least speaks to what kind of potential this team has in terms of hanging with the quote unquote big boys. And I guess you can argue about where LAT ranks or however you want to phrase it, just based on their recent struggles after the holiday break. But we can get a little into that in a little bit.
Yeah, Boston, I think the last point that you mentioned about how they hang with the big boys, and to this point, the Breach have done really well in that regard because they had one of the tougher schedules if you look at it in this Major 1 qualifying period. Obviously, they beat Optic in their first match, and then they beat Carolina, LAT, and then they played Atlanta. They lost to them. And, they had some of the mid-tier, lower-tier teams as well. But I think it's really interesting that they've, other than FaZe, they have really accounted for themselves well in these matchups against what we would consider to be like the top 4 or top 5 teams. But another point that you brought up was the adversity that they kind of overcame after just a really disappointing result against FaZe. It was probably the most lopsided result they've had so far this season, which is kind of something that happened near the end of the year where they were consistently not winning maps. But then they come back, and not only do they rebound from that loss earlier in the weekend, but they rebound from losing 2 straight maps in that series against LAT, where it looked like they were going to get reverse swept, and then they come back and they win a game 5, even though, like you mentioned, the pauses and disconnects, probably could have played a role in that as well. So hopefully we don't deal with any of that, and we're able to get just Call of Duty where we can actually see what these teams are like. A team like Cloud9 New York, who we've talked about with the internet issues, we'll see what they can do on LAN if that is a big difference. But unfortunately for them specifically, they're not going to have too many opportunities to kind of prove that online is completely different from LAN.
And that was the other part. I kind of went off on my spiel a little bit there, and I lost my train of thought. But another reason why I'm looking at this match between Boston and Atlanta as like that, I don't want to say, I don't really have the right phrase to word it. I don't want to say most meaningful or the match I'm most excited for. I just think it could have the biggest impact on the bracket though. Um, Especially in comparison to that other Carolina LA team match that I'm looking at, just the way the bracket shook out. Because whoever loses Boston FaZe drops down to face Cloud9 New York. And we did see Cloud9 you know, force Atlanta to a game 5 on the last day of the qualifiers. Atlanta ended up winning 3-2, but obviously that's a little bit more indicative, I would say, of the form and performances that people were expecting of this C9 roster heading into the year. Um, so, Atlanta versus Boston, there's a world where whoever loses Atlanta versus Boston drops down to face Cloud9, and then Cloud9 shows up on LAN, and that team that started in the winner's bracket is heading home from Madrid in top 12. Um, there's a lot of question marks there because I'm pretty sure Cloud9. I don't know if Cloud9 played Boston in the qualifiers or not. But we obviously know they played Atlanta and they lost them. So even if Boston beats FaZe, who FaZe just beat them, and Atlanta just beat Cloud9, like there's still some wacky stuff that could happen on LAN. Obviously, we talk about that enough on the podcast. How you can't expect everything to go exactly according to plan or exactly how you would expect things to break down on paper. Um, so I bring that up because in comparison to that, like sort of trio of teams of Boston versus Atlanta and the loser plays Cloud9, that Carolina versus Las Vegas, Carolina versus LA Thieves match, the loser of that match, which I do expect to be a close one, drops down to face the Vegas Falcons. And not, to throw unnecessary shade or anything, but
Yeah, it's
we
just an
would
easier
both
matchup.
expect whoever loses between Carolina and LA Thieves to handle business against Vegas and not be in a similar situation. I feel like, you know, it sucks to say it this way, but realistically, I don't think you can take it as bad mouth in Vegas or anything like that. But whoever's in looking at the bracket and thinking they're in the winner's bracket and they got to drop down, if you got to play one team in the loser's bracket in the first round to avoid getting double, first rounded out of the tournament, you want to play Vegas Falcons just because they haven't been able to get the job done in any series. They've at most won one map in a series, I'm pretty sure. And I still think they are winless in Hardpoint, if I remember correctly. So, I don't think we got to harp on it too much. I just think that part of the bracket, in referring to Boston and Atlanta, and then loser facing Cloud9, is more interesting. A lot more storylines, I feel like, than Carolina versus Los Angeles, and then loser plays Vegas. Certainly, there is a big storyline there for either of those, Carolina and LAT losing in the first round, dropping down to the loser bracket, especially LAT, like all that talk about the super team and is anyone even on par with them, yada yada, like earlier in the season, to potentially being in a match where they could, in theory, go home top 12. That would be just an absolutely wild storyline if we end up having to talk about that. I don't foresee that being the situation, but that's the way the bracket shook out, and that's what we're looking at.
Yeah, we're in a weird scenario, and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention Pred. And kind of, I even saw, I think he put on his Instagram story, somebody had tweeted out that he's in Toronto this weekend, which is not like an unusual thing, but it just was like the rumors are a buzz, and like there's just anticipation, I think, in general about where will he end up. And
Yeah.
I think the best or most obvious landing spot for him right now is C9, because they are really on the edge. Like you mentioned, they are not in a good spot regardless, and they face a good team, whoever drops down, whether it be Boston or Atlanta. And I looked it up, C9 and Boston have not played so far this season, not at the minor or in the qualifiers. So maybe that is something that Cloud9 could play to their favor. But Boston has handled themselves very well, regardless of the competition, other than this most recent phase matchup. They were one of the better teams in the minor. They've obviously went 5-2 in the qualifiers. So it's going to be a tough matchup if Boston drops down to play C9. And if FaZe drops down to play C9, I think it goes without saying that that's going to be incredibly tough. And right now, FaZe has won 7 consecutive matches, including the minor, which obviously aren't being added toward these the major one qualifying or the major one points. But in terms of the momentum that they have, that is very real. The fact that they have basically turned it around from how badly they started in the major one qualifiers to win the minor coming out of the break, and they have looked like the best team. Or if you want to look at Optic and them, I think Optic, Toronto, and FaZe have been solidly the top 3 since we've returned from the break, even though Toronto obviously lost to Optic. So it's going to be a really tough matchup for Cloud9, regardless of who they face. I am very much looking forward to Atlanta versus Boston. I think, it's probably not my most, I'm not the most excited about that one, but I think in general, that's just a very exciting matchup, and it really will go to see how far Boston is away from these kind of teams, or if they are right there with them. And maybe we can also see how much different the online results are from the LAN results, because we have this a week apart. And so we can kind of actually compare this exact matchup online versus on LAN. The next matchup I want to talk about, and something that you had kind of mentioned, was Carolina versus LA Thieves. 2 teams that are in completely different positions than they were heading into the break for the holidays. Both of these teams were undefeated heading into Christmas, and coming out of it, I think they both had LAT definitely more than Carolina, but LAT had a very disappointing minor result, and then they have essentially just continued on that disappointment. Carolina did not have as disappointing of a minor, but they have not really been the team that we saw before Christmas. What do you expect out of this matchup, considering both of these teams desperately need a win here?
Yeah, I think this is, it's tough because, again, heading into the season, like if you see a first round matchup in the winners bracket between LA Thieves and Carolina Royal Ravens on paper, you almost everyone is probably thinking Thieves 3-0 30-minute series, right? That was the expectations for both teams realistically heading into the season. Now we're in a position where both of these teams were off the strong starts and have kind of just, sputtered a little bit, or take their foot off the gas a little bit, however you want to phrase it, hit a couple roadblocks, et cetera, et cetera. um so I don't know. I'm excited. I'm really excited to see Slasher back on land. Obviously Slasher had that whole situation last year with Boston and Snoopy, and he wasn't competing the last few events of the season. I've mentioned it at least 5 times already in like the last 10 episodes of like Slasher just having that 1.4 KD on land in one series, major one last year. So you know what the guy's capable of, obviously world champion, all that good stuff. So I'm excited to see him back on land, but I'm excited to see this LA Thieves team on land too. Maybe, that's playing a factor into the results. Like just, it seemed like it was more, at least without knowing too much detail into what's been going on behind the scenes with them. From everything I saw on like the timeline from Nade Shot and the players and whatnot, it was kind of like, the Hydra visa stuff impacted how soon they got back to practice after the holiday break. And that's what's been attributed to this kind of like slow start in the return to action here in 2025. But regardless, like we know what those LAT players are capable of on land too. And I think there was like a CDL promo video I saw on Twitter today too that was like, they asked Hydra what he's excited about. He's like, I'm excited to be on land. So, there's been some questions around Hydra's performance and whatnot. Seeing him back on land, having more Hydra-esque numbers would be very entertaining. So yeah, I just think it's, like I said, it's, neither of these teams wants to lose this matchup. They do know, they don't have a full on safety net, but they have to feel a little bit better. I would think, knowing that if they do lose this matchup, they have a very strong chance of at least advancing past the first round of the losers bracket. But nonetheless, both these teams are going to come out swinging, and it should be a really good one. But just this past week of qualifiers for both teams did play Miami, Carolina, and LAT. LAT played them first and won 3-2, and then Carolina played Miami. I believe the situation was Miami needed to win one map in that series to clinch a winner's bracket spot, and then it might have been, I don't remember where that was, but I'm pretty sure that Miami had to win one map, and then Miami goes up 2-0 against Carolina, and Carolina reverse sweeps. So both Carolina and LAT beat Miami 3-2. But to kick off the qualifiers, Carolina lost to Vancouver 3-2 in a series where they won both hard points, which is worth noting just because Carolina was on a 4 straight hardpoint loss streak, and we were kind of talking about how their hardpoint, the desk was analyzing and breaking it down, how they thought Carolina's hardpoint didn't look as strong as it did at the start of the season. But now we have a series here where they lose both S&Ds and win both hardpoints, which that brought back memories for me of Carolina last year, where we were talking about sort of like that seesaw effect, where it felt like, some weeks they were really good at S&D, couldn't win a respawn, and then vice versa in the following week, right? So that was just a little interesting to me and kind of strange at the same time. So Carolina does go 1-1, but they very realistically could have been 0-2 in these qualifiers heading into this last match. But they did. This is now their second reverse sweep, as far as I remember. Just shows the level of ice these guys have, and we have seen LAT reverse sweep too. So if either of these teams go down 0-2 in this respective matchup, there's a pretty good shot in my mind that it could end up going 5 maps either way. And then we already kind of talked about LATs losing to Boston in the qualifiers. So both of these teams had 2 matches in the final week, and they both were 3-2 matches, and they both went 1-1. So that's a 5-5 map count. So they got a lot of reps in, obviously, heading into, most of these teams I saw left on Monday, I believe, and arrived in Tuesday, trying to, get rid of the jet lag and stuff. So those qualifier matches were probably the last meaningful practice they had outside of anything they were able to do today. So those reps could be invaluable. Just that's literally the maximum number of maps they could play in a qualifier week outside of scrims and whatnot. So we'll have to see what version of both these teams show up, because if both these teams show up in their pre-holiday break form, this could be an absolute banger matchup. I still think it's going to be a really good match, but it could be like two Titans showing off. And I think both of these teams now are out to, in more, I'd say it's more important for LA Thieves to kind of show up and show that they are deserving of that super team moniker or nickname. But even for Carolina, I know we talked about it in like our New Year's resolution episode or whatever, just the fact that like for this Carolina team to get out to this hot start that not a lot of people expected, you want to keep you don't want people to have a reason to doubt you. And if you show up to this first event and struggle against LA Thieves, and then you beat Vegas Falcons and you lose in the second round of the loser bracket and get a top 8 finish, like that's a reason there for people to start doubting this Carolina roster. And then you're talking about all those other things like roster changes, what does the team need to do differently, yada yada. And I think that's just not where Carolina wants to be after such a strong start that they had. So I'm excited for this matchup, excited for the implications, and I think this should be another good one.
Yeah, that's a good point, that both of these teams have a lot to play for. And just in terms of momentum, of course, like we have mentioned already, they drop down, they play Vegas. They both should expect and probably will win that matchup. So they'll at least get to the second round, whether it be winners or losers. But, in terms of momentum, just getting back into the swing of things, being able to get to the winners semis, I guess, would be a big thing. I think certainly LAT, if they lost, it would be a much bigger deal, just because it is LAT. We almost kind of anointed them champions at the beginning of this season, or after their hot start. We just said, oh my God, look how talented and great this team is. And if they fall flat, then the noise around them grows so much louder, especially if Nate Shot is going to keep talking about them and saying like they need to pick it up, so on and so forth. Like, we've talked about it before, but I think it adds, I don't know if it adds pressure necessarily to them, but it definitely adds some kind of noise and distractions to the online stuff where people are now talking about it. I don't know if it actually helps the team or anything like that, but I guess we'll kind of have to see. But yeah, if they are anything like they were before the new year, this should be the best matchup of the weekend, or definitely the best matchup of the first round. Because you're getting two teams that are at their absolute best. We just don't know if they actually will be at their absolute best when it comes to Thursday. Before we go any further, I want to say hello to Username and Christopher Mendez in the YouTube chat. Appreciate you guys stopping by and tuning in. Next matchup I want to talk about was that.
I just want to say real quick too, shout out at Breaks on Twitter, who replied to my tweet that we were going live and said he subscribed, and we officially hit 200 subscribers on the Ego Chall Podcast YouTube, which is awesome to see.
Yeah, shout out to Breaks being the 200th subscriber. We'll send him a hat or something. We definitely won't, but I'll just say I did. Next matchup is Optic versus the Heretics. Like I mentioned at the top of the show, this is probably, in terms of the crowd atmosphere, this is the one that I'm most excited about. Not necessarily the gameplay, because I do expect Optic to win. I think most people probably do at this point, but the crowd can't be understated, and I'm just looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to how if Optic gets booed, really, because Optic never gets booed, never gets the like negative reaction from the crowd. But I think if there ever was a scenario, it would be something like this, where you have an all-Spanish team in the Spanish capital. It feels like there should be some kind of shift in the audience. I don't know if that will be the case. I really don't, because Optic is a global brand and they certainly have their fans across the world. But I don't think it'll really have that big of an impact on the outcome. I just don't tend to think that actually has anything to do with it. But I'm just looking forward to it anyway. And there's always the chance that Real will pop off and be the superstar that I think we both think like he has the capability to be. And this will be a great platform for him to do that on. Just the major in general, but also just against Optic and being able to show out against the most popular team on a gigantic stage for a guy so young. I think he's only like 19 or 20 years old. So looking forward to this one, but I certainly expect Optic to win. Is that kind of the mindset that you're going into this match with?
Yeah, that's where my head's at too. I mean, even I'm not expecting Optic to get severely booed. I mean, it definitely is worth mentioning. We, like you mentioned at the top, it's an event in Spain, and we haven't had a European event in a long time. I know a lot of just people in the community like to gas the European crowd and their chants and all that stuff. And although I don't necessarily agree with all of those takes on European crowds and whatnot, that's a topic for a different day. Um, I think even in a world where this fan or the crowd just like is super against Optic, you have players that have been in that position before. In Kenny, when he was on LA Thieves, like the crowd was he did the whole Kylo Ken thing when they're playing Optic, right? Um, and even Shotzi and Hook when they were on the Empire, like they go up against Optic, they had to deal with the booze. So it's like, I don't think it's going to be a major factor. It should be interesting from a fan perspective just to see the atmosphere and all that stuff. We'll have to see how it turns out. But yeah, I think this is kind of what we talked about on the last episode, or maybe 2 episodes ago. Just we both kind of said it didn't look great for Miami to get a spot in the winners bracket, but we wanted it to be a reality just because it would have sucked if this quote unquote home event for the all Spanish team. They only got one guaranteed match in the losers bracket. Uh, so even in a world where Optic does win this match, which is what most people are probably expecting, we'll at least get to see at the absolute minimum 2 matches for Miami with this, what is expected to be a very hyped and excited all crowd for. Wow, I just butchered that, but was expected to be a crowd full of very excited and enthusiastic Spanish Call of Duty fans. Um, so yeah, I think got to go with Optic as the favorite here, especially to round out their qualifiers. Last week on Sunday, they did beat Toronto, like you mentioned, and that was literally a battle for the first seed. Optic wins it; they get the first seed. That's what puts us in this position for the Optic phase match. I did think it was funny. I put in the notes Looney, who's the coach of the Minnesota Rocker, and had um a lengthy playing career before moving on to coaching. He tweeted on October 19th, which I assume was around the time that leaks and reports started happening of the 2025 CDL schedule. He tweeted, somehow, some way, if that Barcelona event is true, Heretics will play Optic first round. Um, so he either saw the future or just had a super big brain moment there. And shout out Looney because I thought that was pretty funny. Obviously we've talked before about the whole Optic versus Florida Mutineers and that entire I don't think rivalry is the right word, just the matchup history. Um, kind of hasn't been the same just in the past year with the transition to Miami Heretics. But who knows? Maybe this is the turning point for that, matchup, and maybe Miami comes out, stuns the world, and causes massive chaos in the bracket. That'd certainly get the crowd going, get a lot of people talking in the community. I just think Optics has been looking too strong, and especially I got off track there. Winning that last matchup against Toronto, who was previously undefeated in the qualifiers, and they looked really strong in Search and Destroy. We were talking about how they're, at this point, they looked like the best search team in the league, just because they had, I think, an 8-2 or 7-2 record. Their only two map losses were on Hacienda, which was the newest map added to the map pool for all the modes. But in this matchup between Optic and Toronto to end the qualifiers, Optic beat Toronto map 2 red card S&D to what I think was Toronto's first S&D loss, not on Hacienda. And I know I highlighted that last week when we were doing our predictions and previews of the qualifiers, as map 2 was the big one I had circled for that showdown between Toronto and Optic, just because of how strong Toronto had looked in search. And if Optic could pull off a win in the game 2, then things would probably look good for them. And then that's what turns out happening with a 3-1 win for Optic, gives them the first seed, sets us up for this juicy first round matchup on land with Miami. So long-winded way of saying, Optic Miami is exciting in, I guess, maybe not necessarily the same sense as some of the other matches we've gone over in terms of what could happen in the server. I think Optic's the pretty strong favorite just in terms of the talent on the team. But, maybe like you said, maybe the crowd could be the X factor and maybe we see a wild upset.
Yeah, I think we should also mention that like in addition to Optic just being this kind of unstoppable, like to this point right now, they lost that first matchup to Boston, then they win that one against Cloud9 New York where they just absolutely rolled them, and then they had that roster change. Pred goes out, Hoot comes in. They are 5-0 since then. They've looked really good, especially recently in the qualifying matches at least. If you look at Miami, they have lost all of their matches 3-2. They've lost in game 5. Actually, the only match that they have not gone to game 5 was their first match, and that was against Vegas. Everything else has been to a game 5. Of course, it just hasn't worked out well for them because they're 2-5 going in this, so they're 1-5 in game 5 so far this season. So not great, but I also think that if they're close enough, maybe they're able to squeak out a win. They're certainly not one of those teams like Vegas that we've mentioned where it's just like, okay, they can't really win this one particular game mode. They can't win, even 2 maps in a series. For Vegas, it's just been they fall short of the goal line every single time or almost every single time. They did end up beating Cloud9 last weekend, I think it was, or the weekend before. So they've been able to get to game 5. It just, if they're able to win that 5th game, and that's going to be a tough challenge, especially like you mentioned, if Optic is going to be solid in search and destroy, I think it's going to be tough for any team to beat them, let alone Miami. But I'm, looking forward to it. I think it should be a pretty interesting matchup. Regardless, if you're thinking about just the crowd, then it's going to deliver, I think, on what people are putting it up to be. But if you're looking at the gameplay, I think it's going to be at least interesting. I don't know if it's going to be super closely contested, but it has the possibility of doing that as well. And then the last first round matchup of the weekend, I think there's probably the least hype about this particular match, but probably shouldn't be. Toronto versus Vancouver. Of course, Vancouver is not on that level at least in terms of reputation. But if you remember, this is actually a week 1 matchup that we saw in early December. These two teams played. It was actually Vancouver's first match of the CDL season, and it went to a game 5 round 11, and Toronto ends up winning that. Obviously, the Ultra ended up winning their first 6 matches in total. They lost to Optic this weekend, like you said, but I don't think that can be completely discounted that there was a very competitive matchup early in the season between these two teams. Vancouver actually won the first 2 respawns of that series, and then Toronto won 2, 4, 5, win the series, and they end up getting a really good seed. Vancouver was really scratching and clawing to get into the winners bracket these last 2 weeks. I think they won 3 straight to get into this winners bracket and to have a shot at, playing a few matches, not just one in Madrid. But yeah, I think Toronto's definitely the favorite. I'm going to go with Toronto. I expect you to go with Toronto. But is there any kind of intrigue here between the Ultra and Surge for you?
I just think, obviously, I don't want to say it's 2 teams in opposite trajectories just because of 1 loss for Toronto against Optic, which, is different than if Toronto lost to another team. But just for lack of better way of phrasing it. Like, Toronto is coming off that loss to Optic, and Vancouver just had a 2-0 week in the qualifiers. They won 3-2 both matchups against Carolina and Minnesota. Um, the Minnesota matchup in particular was just an absolute banger. 0-4 set the record. I don't know if it's a overall CDL record. I feel like it would be for a 5-map series. But it certainly, they said, the record for this year nonetheless. 0-4 dropped 138 kills in that series against Minnesota. That ended up going game 5 round 11. And even on the other side for Minnesota, I think the next three in terms of kill records this year: Estriel at 129, Geo 121, and Nero at 120. I think like Kismet had like a 118 or 119 kill. That was the record before this matchup. But this matchup between Minnesota and Vancouver had 4 players enter the top 5 in most kills for a CDL series this year at the minimum, potentially, even more implications than just this year in the CDL. But nonetheless, just a wild series with tons of engagements and tons of kills, obviously. And I think that's just, like you got to think the way Vancouver, kind of like you said, they had their backs against the wall. They almost needed to win both of these matches to be in this conversation, to have a winner's bracket spot, and that's what they were able to get done. So it's a team that we've talked about. They have some talent, and it's just a question of how they're going to be able to put it together. This might technically be a revenge match for Hixie, if you want to count it, even though you said they played Toronto earlier this year, but it's on land, so different environment. Nonetheless, yeah, I think this is probably a little more exciting of a matchup due to Vancouver's recent matchups in the last week of the qualifiers than if this last week didn't happen and Toronto was sitting at 6-0 and Vancouver was 2-3 or whatever. I think 2-3. Then I don't think a lot of people are looking at this match as one like, oh, I gotta watch this. But now I do think there's just a little bit more intrigue to it. And like you said, if the first matchup between these teams went game 5 round 11, just the way both these teams have been playing, who knows if we get a repeat of that. It's also possible if I don't think necessarily Toronto's search is taking a dip or anything like that, but if we always talk about on the podcast, like a round 11 could go either way. If that was the difference between Vancouver and Toronto last time, who's to say, something else small like that could, cause an upset or something here. So just an interesting one that might not have been as interesting just a couple of days ago. But the way everything shakes out, that's what we get, these storylines that form from the bracket. I said it on the last episode. I know I said, we always do these shows where we're doing the last set of qualifier matchups and talking about them, and something happens that we didn't expect and it shakes up the bracket. And this was probably it. I don't think either of us really expected Vancouver to be one of the teams in the winners bracket, but here they are. And they have that potential with the 0-4 and Abuza combo to, especially if 0-4 is dropping 138 kills or whatever it is. That's just absurd. They got that talent to be competitive. This is going to be a tough test for them again, but if it was close first time around, could be close again on land.
And Vancouver, I think we should also just mention that they were kind of, I can't say the victim of just the front load scheduling, where they played Toronto, Boston, and Optic in their first 2 weeks, I think. And they lost all 3 of those matches. And I think we just in general kind of counted them out, or at least put them on the back burner, so to speak, even though that's probably not fair, because those, as it turns out, are 3 of the best teams in the league. And those 3 teams are now, I think, the top 3 or 4 seeds at this major. So they lost those matches, and then they came back and they beat the teams that we expected them to beat. They beat Vegas in the first week back from the break and stuff, and then this weekend, as you mentioned, beating Carolina is a huge moment for them. and then they beat Minnesota as well, which Minnesota has been kind of reeling, but is certainly a competitive team and has the capability to beat most of the teams in the CDL, in my opinion. So, it's a big thing for Vancouver, but we maybe the scheduling kind of made it so that we just didn't think they had much of a chance, even though they have proven to be somewhat competitive, lost in game fives to Toronto and Boston. So they're a really good team. In terms of the talent, I think is I think they have a high ceiling for what it's worth. It's just I don't know how close they are to that ceiling, but like you mentioned, if 04 is going to do that, then their ceiling is sky high, it would seem. And we've talked about Abuza before and how talented he is and the potential he has as an individual player. It's just about kind of tapping into that in a very big match to start the first major. I think we should also just say that this is technically the Ultras major, so I don't know if the fans will be on Toronto's side because of that. So I don't know what the crowd will be like for that, but it does seem like an interesting matchup, even if it is going to be overshadowed by some of the other matches in the first round of this major. I don't know how much more we want to go into it, but obviously we have these four teams in the losers bracket: LAG, Vegas, Minnesota, and Cloud9 New York. As we've mentioned, this is a bad position to be in general. So LAG, for example, they play the loser of Optic versus Miami. Not a great not a great situation to be in, especially I think if Miami's able to pull off an upset, because then you're playing probably a pissed off Optic Texas in the first round of the losers bracket. Vegas, we've mentioned LAT and Carolina will drop down. Minnesota, they play Toronto or Vancouver, and C9 will play Atlanta or Boston. None of that sounds particularly great. I think Minnesota probably would be like, okay, like if we play Vancouver, we just lost to them just barely. I think we have a good shot. Any of these teams do you think could make a run through the losers bracket or has the best chance to do so?
That's where my head was at. I kind of set the stage a little bit there with the talking about that Vancouver versus Minnesota banger matchup. Um, we just don't know what this Minnesota team's going to look like on land. Like they've shown they have the capability to pull off reverse sweeps in the online portion of the season. It's a young team though, so not sure exactly what we're going to get from them. But if Toronto is able to beat Vancouver, we get a Vancouver versus Minnesota rematch in the loser bracket. I think that's probably that matchup that I'm most excited for down there in the lower bracket, outside of something crazy happening in the winners bracket that causes like a phase versus C9 or an optic versus General Mates situation. So yeah, I think that's probably Minnesota's probably just the way things shake out in the bracket. Minnesota has a decent shot to pull something off, and because we've seen them pull off run in the minor with those reverse sweeps, I don't want to sleep on Gentlemates though. If outside of the home crowd buff potential there for Miami, the Gentlemates squad just they have the potential to they have the talent and seem to be, I don't want to say necessarily hitting their stride, but they seem to be playing a little bit better in recent weeks. The only thing we have to judge that on for this past week of qualifiers was a 3-0 win over the Vegas Falcons. So can't put too much stock into that at this point. But nonetheless, just even before that, I think in the previous week, that was the week I was talking about them playing a little bit more Skyline hardpoint, getting Priest on a third SMG, and I think they went 1-1 in that week, but it still showed like good signs of potential for me. So Gentlemates could, if Miami drops down there, that seems like a winnable match for Gentlemates, but that just Gentlemates has had some winnable matches this year and just haven't had them go their way yet. So tough to put a lot of stock in them yet, but I do believe in all those guys on that team and the potential they have to turn things around from a rough start to the year. And then obviously Cloud9, I think that's probably just it's tough because the Gentleman squad has 3 world champions on it, but just on paper, like that C9 team was had the highest expectations of the 4 teams in the losers bracket coming into the season. It's another really talented team, so they have the potential if LAN actually works out for them and they don't have the same issues they've had earlier in the year with online stuff. But yeah, I just think in general, tough situation to be in for all the loser bracket teams. Obviously, having the thought of just a one and done, basically. But I do think there are some winnable matchups here. It's just going to be a matter of what team drops down and how both those teams are playing, because it's also you got to deal with the fact of those teams in the loser bracket, like Cloud9, Gentle Mates, and Minnesota. We can sit here and say on paper they got winnable matchups against certain teams, but at the end of the day, that'll be their first matchup on land. The team they're playing, even if they lose, well, even though they lost, they'll have had a rep on land in that environment already the day before. So then it'll become a question of how much does that rep outweigh, or how much of a factor is that, as opposed to the psyche aspect of losing that first matchup and all that stuff. So long-winded way of saying I do think there is some potential for some of these teams in the lower bracket to cause some chaos, but might not be a ton of upsets. I think personally, we'll go through our predictions here in a second and get it in, officially done. But the way the bracket is shaking out, let's just say we go the way the winners bracket looks right now, there's the potential for Optic versus LA Thieves, and then Toronto versus FaZe for a shot at the winners bracket final. And I think that's basically like a dream scenario if you could draw it up for just like unbiased CDL fans wanting to see the best action. Like that was probably, I know for me, we talked a lot about the top three heading into the season being LAT, Optic, and FaZe in no particular order. Then I had Toronto in 4. I think that 4 spot was a little bit more contested before the teams actually played, but nonetheless, like right now, I think those are, it's tough to say with LAT's little downturn, but they're 4 really good teams. And if those are the teams fighting for a shot at the winners final, then the winners final is going to be 2 just really tough teams that had to beat a previously really good team just to get there, and that's before the grand finals. Like that sets the stage for a really exciting major if it goes that way.
Yeah, and that means it won't go that way, because that's typically if we think it's going to go chalk, it's going to go at least one way off the beaten path. And I think Carolina has a really good shot at kind of upsetting the apple cart, so to speak, or we'll see what happens with Boston and Atlanta. But I think there's definitely possibilities for upsets. But like you mentioned, I think most people would think it's going to be chalk, and because those top 4 teams are very, very good. The losers bracket, I think it's going to be really tough for any of those to make a run, really far, maybe win 2 matches. I just don't see those 4 teams doing it. But if there was a team, I'm kind of out on Cloud9 right now, so I'd probably go LAG, because I've been on the LAG bandwagon all season. I still believe that they're a good team. They're eventually going to have to show it or not, I guess. But yeah, let's go through the predictions real quick just to make sure that we have it, official and everything. So I think we're both going with Optic over Miami.
Yes.
I'm going to go with LAT over Carolina.
Let's do the next 2. Are you going Toronto over Vancouver?
Yes.
Okay. And then Atlanta over Boston?
Yes.
All right. I'll go with Carolina over LA Thieves, just so we have something different. I do expect LA Thieves to win if they show up in the form that, we know they're capable of and everyone expects them to produce. But something about Land Slasher, man, that's got me at least just thinking this could go Carolina's way. And I think like the nade shot reaction and community reaction to LA Thieves losing their first matchup at the major, I can't say on land because they played that case on land or whatever, but losing their first matchup and then dropping down to Vegas, and just the like threat, even if it's a very, very minuscule threat of LA Thieves getting a last place finish at Major 1 after all the hype, like I think the community could go in like full on meltdown. Like nade shots reaction should be a good clip. But we'll have to see if that's how it goes. I'll go with Carolina just for the memes and for the sake of having a different pick, but I do expect LAT to take this one.
I really need them to lose both of their matches especially because the second is against Vegas. I will tune in to Nate Shot's stream, or I will put on his Twitter notification, something. I will make sure that I'm there and seated for his meltdown if they lose to Vegas. Like you said, it's very likely not going to happen. Regardless if they lose to Carolina, which is, I think it's definitely like a good possibility. Like, I don't know what the percentage is or anything, but there's at least like a 35% chance that they lose that matchup. I just don't see them losing to Vegas as well, but I guess that's why they play the games, right?
Yep.
Who are you going with as your champion? Obviously, we have a few teams that I think are above the rest, or we think are above the rest. Optic finishes above everyone else in the seeding. They beat Toronto in the last weekend, but Atlanta has been on this hot run over the last 2 or 3 weeks. And then, there is Toronto. They finished on a sour note, and I think they would be probably, if they had beaten Optic, I think the conversation around them is a lot different, at least on this podcast, because they would be 7-0. They would have beaten Optic to finish it out, who had already, Optic had that win streak. So Toronto would be a favorite, or maybe even a greater favorite. And then there's like LAT, the team that I think if you asked us a month ago, we would have said they're definitely the favorites to win Major 1. I don't think either one of us think that now, because we've seen what's happened over the last 3 weekends. Carolina, which I don't think we would have said they're the favorite to win Major 1, but we certainly would not have counted it out. And I don't think we count it out now, but it seems less likely than it did before. So who are you thinking about who will possibly win the first major of the CDL season?
I think Optic is the safe answer right now. Just the fact they played so well against Toronto to round out the qualifiers is a really good indication of what they're capable of, especially because of the way Toronto had looked beforehand. I'm going to pick FaZe as my Major 1 winner. I seemingly always end up going with FaZe as my tournament winner. But we saw what they seem to be the hottest team right now, hitting their stride, especially in the minor, and carrying the momentum from there. So I think we know what that squad's capable of. They're a dangerous team, and I'm going to pick FaZe. I think Optic is probably the top pick, even though they're number 1 seed, so they're probably and most popular team, so they're probably the most popular pick to win the whole thing, if I had to guess. But realistically, like, not trying to say this as a cop out answer, because I said I'm picking FaZe, but if we get that winners bracket breakdown the way we said it, as like Optic versus LA Thieves and then Toronto versus FaZe, in my eyes, you can make a strong argument for all 4 of those teams to win the major. And it's going to come down to which team beats those teams and then beats the team that beat the other 2 teams. Or, I worded that poorly, but just, it's going to be, if that's how it shakes out in the winners bracket, it's going to be a grueling tournament in just terms of good teams playing good teams. No easy road or cakewalk to the grand finals. And whoever ends up winning it all will have earned it by, in theory, taking down at least 2 of the top 4 teams, potentially 3 if, like, let's just say Optic beats LA Thieves, then Optic beats FaZe, and somehow Toronto makes it to the grand finals, like, and Optic wins. Like, they would go through LA Thieves and FaZe and Toronto to win the whole thing. Like, that's at this point in the season, that would be super impressive. And just at any point in the season, like, the quote unquote top dogs, you're able to go through multiple strong teams to get there. That has to mean a little bit more, at least in my eyes. But so yeah, we'll have to see how it shakes out. I think you're right. Like, especially me now hyping this up as that potential winners bracket. There's a strong likelihood it doesn't happen just because I'm hyping it up so much. But I'm very hopeful that's what we get, because I think it'll cause a lot of interesting narratives for us on the next show. And I do think if that is how it shakes out, that you can make a strong case for any of those 4 teams to be hoisting the trophy on Sunday.
Yeah, we didn't get to see that a ton last season, where we thought we had 4 teams that were just above the rest, and I think most of the season we had like 3 of them make it to this to the winter semis, and then it's like who's going to be the other team, who's going to round out this top four, because somebody disappointed in the first round. Unfortunately, it was the subliners for a good part of the season. They just weren't up to the level at the majors. I don't know if it'll work out like that. It definitely seems like those four teams have the best chance. But I'm going to go with LAT. I think they are not in a good position in terms of just the recent results. But I tend to think that they just have the most talent, and it's not a huge gap between them, Optic, and FaZe. I think I just don't. I'm not like a big Toronto believer, to be honest. So I think there is like a top three in terms of talent, and then there is Toronto, and then kind of the rest at that point. But I think LAT, especially because if they beat Carolina in the first round, I think they'll have the confidence back a little bit. I don't know if it's even gone, but I think if it is, beating Carolina and getting to the next round, and they will definitely have some motivation to beat Optic because they lost to them just a week ago. I just think that LAT is the best team at this current point in time. I also was leaning toward FaZe too. I think LAT and FaZe, at least, like, it's really hard to separate those top three in my mind: Optic, LAT, and FaZe. But I don't know, like, it's just a gut feeling, I guess, at this point. So I'm gonna go with the Thieves, but I'm very easily could be very wrong by the end of this major, and we'll see what happens. Let's anything else, or I guess we just should mention, like you mentioned, the matches start at 10 a.m. Eastern on Thursday. So if you're on the East Coast, 10 a.m. is when the matches will begin. And then it starts earlier on Friday and Saturday. It starts at 8:30 a.m. on Friday and Saturday, and then again at 10 a.m. on Sunday. There's a useful graphic that the CDL tweeted out where it says set your alarms, and then those are the official start times for each of the rounds. So if you don't want to start at the beginning of the day, you could see what, if you're looking just for like the winners round 2 stuff, then you can go to that point. But I think, that's something that we should mention before, we just stop talking about the major as much. Did you have anything else on the major to talk about?
No, I don't think. I think we were pretty thorough on that. We want to talk about the Challenger stuff and the rest of the season.
Yeah, so this was stuff that got announced about 5 days ago. So this is something that we would have probably talked about at some point if we had the most recent episode. But there, we talked about it on probably our holiday pods at this point. We were talking about like the Challenger stuff and what the rest of the season is going to look like, because there was uncertainty about where Major 4 would be and how it would be hosted and everything. So the CDL announced on, I believe, the 24th that the fourth and final major of the 2025 season will be hosted by DreamHack at DreamHack Dallas. It will be May 23rd to the 25th in Dallas, Texas, which I think DreamHack was something that was rumored for last season, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was DreamHack Atlanta, and
that might have been it, yeah.
And it didn't end up coming to fruition. And obviously we did not have a major. What was it? Major 4, Major 5 was without a host last year. So thankfully, it's not something like that this year. We will have a fourth major in Dallas, hosted by DreamHack. And the stuff that we talked about with Challengers and the uncertainty about if Optic would be able to host a Challengers event for Major 2. The CDL announced that there will be 3 Challengers Open events this season, starting with Major 2. So Major 1, obviously this weekend, will not have a Challengers Open as far as I know. I think I was talking about this with Bank before we went on the air, but I said that from what I remember, there was going to be a Challengers event when they were in Barcelona, but then when the venue got moved and it eventually was changed to Madrid, I believe that's when the Challengers Open was kind of nixed for Major 1. I could be mistaken, but that's something I vividly remember. But regardless, Major 2 will have a Challengers Open, so will Major 3 and Major 4. The CDL announced that there will be $100,000 at stake for each of those events. and then just a shit ton of challengers points. There's 25,000 points for first place. I don't know how the challengers points like shake out and how many people have in general, but I thought we should mention that. They also mentioned that there will be challengers at the Esports World Cup, and that that'll happen with I think it's kind of like pretty much their version of the Pro Am, and like they had it last year, where challengers players can actually play against the CDL teams. That's not the case for the rest of the season, but they said that at the challenge or at the Esports World Cup, they will be able to compete with CDL pros and fight for a $1.8 million prize pool. So that's interesting and good that there at least is some kind of communication from the CDL and challengers players, because there's been just a lot of negative information or negative maybe resentment is probably a good word toward the CDL and toward Microsoft and Activision for how little has been communicated to challengers players about the future of the Path to Pro system. So at least there's something there. Any thoughts on that? All of this stuff, Major 4 being at DreamHack Dallas, or the Challengers Opens being, having 3 this season?
Yeah, I think the DreamHack Dallas, pretty sure that was reported on earlier. At least the fact of it being a Dallas event was reported on earlier before the season started. So I don't think that comes as a massive shock. I think it was just like sorting things out and finalizing and making it official. Never been to a DreamHack event myself, and I don't know what they entail. I'm pretty sure there's gonna be Counter Strike at it based on what I saw, like people commenting on the timeline and stuff. Um, so regardless of the exact details of DreamHack, like just the fact of like it had it in theory it should have more of that like MLG event esque feel to it. Just multiple games, communities mingling, all that sort of feel and stuff that we've talked about, like potentially seeing a return to that in the future. Hopefully, fingers crossed. Um, so maybe this is a step towards that. Obviously, don't want to look too far into it. It could also at the same time be just like I don't want to say a way to save money, but it could, you know, if like the venue's already like set up and whatever, then like it could in theory be just a cheaper way of hosting the event. I don't know. Not gonna. It seems like most people are excited about this being at DreamHack Dallas and think it's a good thing. So I'm gonna tend to uh, agree and think hopefully this is a step in towards a brighter future of potentially more COD crossing over with other games and having more of an MLG esque event like what we saw in the past. But um, we'll talk more about DreamHack Dallas as we get closer to that Major 4, since we're only at Major 1 now. I do think the Challenger stuff is important, though, just because we talked about on one of the previous episodes not too long ago about Hex's comment of saying that like it seemed like there wasn't going to be a Challengers event at the Optic Major 2. I don't think Hex has said anything since this was announced by the CDL. So we don't necessarily know, like, does this mean the CDL stepped in and gave, Optic some financial assistance with the event? I would tend to think, like, yes, because that's what in the previous clip, I believe Hex said, like, if the CDL isn't helping financially, we're just not going to do it. So the fact that a Challenger event is happening at Major 2 makes me think that the CDL is helping in some shape or form. But we don't know for sure. Maybe Hex will talk about it at some point coming up. Maybe he won't. End of the day, though, just the fact that we know now, because it wasn't too long ago, I was saying like what you just said. Like it was very hard for me to even try and find a schedule for challengers online, and wasn't even sure if there was anything going on with challengers at this event. It was very difficult to find any information, and just the fact that we have it laid out now. We know there's 3 lands, a challengers final, basically challengers champs, and then the World Cup if you do well at they laid out all the way you can qualify for challengers finals in esports World Cup through the challenger system. So just the fact that we have that information now has got to be better late than never, right? Like we got it. It's there now. You know what you got to do if you're a challengers player. Um, Limited opportunities. Obviously, if there's only 3 events, and if you aren't one of those top teams to qualify for Champs or World Cup, like you got 3 shots to make it happen. So it's going to be a grind. That's the pit is always, a grind, and it's always very fierce and competitive. Now more than ever, with you know, especially with all the Vegas team coming in with the all Saudi roster, and last year the all Spanish roster coming in for Heretics. There's in theory more pros or former CDL pros competing in challengers, which means it's even harder in theory for some of those up and coming players to win these events and make a name for themselves. But you know what you got now. You got 3 shots, and you got to make them count if you're somebody trying to make a name for yourself. So I'm just glad. End of the day, they finally CDL stepped up, and laid this stuff out. I definitely think this should have happened sooner, much earlier
Months ago.
Than it happened now on January 24th or whatever it was. But can't think about that now. Now it's out there. We got it. We crossed the finish line in terms of just getting the basic information we needed. Now, like I said, you're a challengers player. You know what you got to do if you want to make the season count. It's all laid out in front of you. You just gotta seize the opportunity and take advantage and go from there.
Yeah, at least they know what they're playing for now, which was not the case like a week ago. Pick 'em so far this season. So I went 7-2 in the last week of the qualifiers. You went 5-4. So you are ahead by 2 matches, 34-19. I'm at 32-21. Obviously, there probably will be some changes during the major. So we only picked the first 4 matches, the winners bracket round 1 matches, but then we'll text each other as the tournament is going on and give our picks, and then we'll update you guys on the next episode how we did on our picks. Enjoy the major, obviously, on Thursday. It should be really fun. At least there is a major to enjoy. We've had a long road to get here because of because we started in early December, the first week of the CDL season, the first qualifying week of the CDL season. Then we had 4 matches and then a gigantic break, and then we've only had a few qualifying matches in the minor, but something different I think is much needed, and we'll see if Bink's European bias or anti-European bias for the crowds will come to fruition, if they are not as good as it has been hyped up, or if they will be even better than what we're expecting, and maybe we should make it an annual trip over to Europe for these events. Make sure to like, subscribe, or follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. We're Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and YouTube. Like Bink mentioned, we are now at, I guess, 200 subscribers on YouTube, but we would love to have more. I think the plan or the goal was to have 200 subscribers by Major 1, which was not a plan that we actually had set until we started getting a bunch of subscribers over the last 3-4 weeks, and then it became a possibility, and now we're kind of realizing that possibility. So we want to thank you guys for all of your support over the last, really, if you've been supporting us for this entire time, we really appreciate it, because we've been doing the podcast for a few years now, but we've definitely put in more time and more effort over these last 2 months or so, which is, I think it has grown the podcast a lot, and we've seen a lot of more engagement as far as people coming into the chat or people commenting on YouTube, and coming in and checking out the shows, which we always appreciate. But yeah, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel for the podcast videos. I'm not sure when we'll get back to the daily YouTube videos, but we will eventually hopefully get back to uploading daily videos on the YouTube channel, and hopefully that'll be sometime soon. You can follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2 Ks, at Pres Byers podcast. Twitter is at Ego Chall Podcast, and twitch.tv/jbink, so JBINKK, for Bink's race. I think he's up to 22 days or something like that on his Twitch stream.
21.
So 21, yeah. So we're at 3 weeks now for Bink consecutively streaming. So go and follow him on Twitch. Next show will probably be on Sunday, February 2nd. Not entirely sure. So just not to end on a very sad note, But I just wanted to mention because I put it on the YouTube community tab on Thursday or Friday. I can't remember exactly what day that was. But my father passed away Thursday morning, and I drove back to Columbus, where I'm from, to be with my mom and my family. And I'm going back on Friday this week, and I'm coming back on Sunday. So the funeral is on Friday, so that's kind of the thing right now. But I will let Bink know if I'm not up to doing the podcast on Sunday or when I can do it or so on and so forth. But, I just wanted to let you guys know that it's okay. Like I'm not a complete mess, just like half of a mess right now. But I really appreciate like having this podcast to do and kind of taking my mind off of it a lot of times. And it's been fun. Obviously, I hope that we can get back to the normal schedule soon. And hopefully we will do that. But I will let you guys know, and I'll let Bink know, and we'll figure something out to make sure that we can do that when that time comes. But yeah, I expect to be back home on Sunday. I expect to do the podcast on Sunday. The matches will be well over, I think, by the time that I get in town. So I'll have to catch up on some of that. But I'll try to do that. But yeah, not to end on the saddest note possible in Ego Chall podcast history. But yeah, we should be doing regular shows again. And yeah, we'll let you know just for sure. I don't know how to transition out of this. So Bink, take it away.
Obviously, thoughts and prayers for you and your family dealing with all this stuff. But yeah, we'll let you know when we go live. Either way, we'll be back at some point, and we'll have a ton of stuff to talk about whenever we are back. So look forward to all that. But yeah, like Preston said, hitting 200 subs on YouTube, definitely exciting. Thank you to all those first 200. But hopefully we have many more subs to come and many more to thank. As we keep on going on this journey with the Ego Chall podcast. So shout out to all you guys watching and listening and supporting so far. But yeah, Major One, it's here. Like Preston said, if you're on the East Coast in the U.S. or just anywhere in the U.S., make sure you check out the CDL's Twitter for that graphic of the start times and in your local time zone and all that stuff. I know I'm already internally debating whether I'm gonna wake up for the matches on the next couple days. Tomorrow should be okay, 10 o'clock Eastern my time, but after that, it's a little earlier than I like to wake up. So we'll have to see how I do personally with that. But end of the day, we got a lot of exciting things coming up for the podcast and with this major in general. Should be a really interesting one. Should hopefully have a bunch of stuff to talk about and some good narratives, storylines, all that jazz. Once we know the winner, and even Preston teased it a little bit with once Major One ends, the whole Pred saga could start with his potential return. So a lot to look forward to. But by the time you hear from us again, someone will have won Major One, and then we'll be here to break it all down. So enjoy the major. We'll be back at some point. We'll let you know when that is, and just thank you for all the support overall. Really do appreciate it. And yeah, that